So I was contacted by Domino Belgium, a European distributor for scale modeling supplies, to test out mission models. They recently came out with an automotive paint line for scale modeling. They sent out a really big amount of paints, and when I mean big, I pretty much mean their entire catalog of automotive paints that they have released. So I decided to go with one of their crazier colors in this batch to do a first test on the Aoshima Vertex Soarer that I just unboxed, just to show what these paints are capable of, try them out, and see what I can do with them. So for this one, I decided just to go with a standard white primer to start off with, just to see how that works, and then move that primer over to their pink primer, just again to see how that works on top of the white primer, so that I've used both. And for color, I decided to go with a Pearl Wild Berry. It's a pretty pink color with a nice flip-flop to it and a lot of metallics in there, so I'm excited to see what that will look like. And I could decide to use their clear coat as well. It's a 1K clear coat, meaning it's a bit softer, and I'm not really sure if I'm gonna get the sheen and clear glossy finish that I desire, but I could just try it out. Otherwise, this paint is compatible with pretty much any other paint out on the market, so I could just clear coat it with a nice 2K clear to seal it in and make it super glossy. So these paints are formulated to be brushed on with a regular brush, or just to go through pretty much any airbrush out on the market. Now, in order to change it from a brushable paint to an airbrush paint, they have supplied me with some of their thinners too. This is also their airbrush cleaner. It's a pretty much a 2-in-1, so that is really nice. You just add a couple of drops. They advise to use 20 to 30%. So let's say if you use 10 drops of paint, use 2 to 3 drops of the thinners, and it should be suitable to go through the airbrush perfectly. Now let's prep the body, see what this paint is all about, and get into the spray booth. So as with just about any other project, this one is no different. I'm going to start off by marking all of the mold lines on the body. These are left from the molding process to meet up with the 2 mold halves, and of course are not supposed to be there on the actual car, so they need to be cleaned up. I'm marking them off with a permanent marker to show me where they exactly are, and give me a visual reference, which is easier to see, and also help as a guide coat, because during the sanding the black will be removed, and so should that mold line be as well. All of the mold lines have now been removed with the sanding sticks, which are about 400 grit. And those need to be refined and removed a little bit with a 600 grit, and the rest of the body also needed to be sanded with that same grit for the primer to stick to it. After sanding the entire body to a nice matte finish, making sure that everything was sanded, I placed it onto a Tamiya spray stand to hold it during painting, and then brush off all of the dust that is still left over from the sanding with a Tamiya brush. Once that's done, I move it into the spray booth and prepare it even further before applying primer, just blowing over the entire body with some air through the airbrush to remove even more of the dust on the body itself. So Domino sent out multiple different primer colors for me to test, so I decided to do that as well. First off, I'm just going to prime the body with a couple coats of white primer to see if that works really well, how it works, and how it compares to the other primer colors mission models have to offer. So I'm just going to put in some primer in the airbrush, add a bit of thinner according to the thinning ratios supplied by mission models, which is roughly 30 to 40% of thinners for the primers. Now you could use a little bit less, and I would advise to, just to test it out and see how it flows through your airbrush. If it doesn't flow through nicely, just add a bit more and just keep adding and mixing it like that. Don't over thin it, as then it doesn't really want to cover all that nicely or stick as well to the body panels. The settings I'm using for my airbrush are the same as always and pretty much won't be changed for any other paint. I'm just going to be using the 2 bar or 30 psi setting, and that's the same as I always use it, and that works fine for me. Now maybe that doesn't work fine for you, that's also completely understandable, so just feel free to test out some of the thickness for the paint and also the settings for the airbrush that have worked for you in the past. Most likely those will work for these paints too. So the first couple coats of white primer have been applied and let cure. They dried up to a nice white eggshell finish and are good for the next color to be applied on top of it. Now in this case I'm not going to be applying a color on top of it, I'm just going to go to the next color of primer, which is pink primer, to again see how that works and also create a nice base for the pink color that I'm going to be applying on top of the primer, of course. So again, just like the white primer, I'm going to start off with those hard to reach, easy to forget spots to get it fully covered, then move on to the rest of the body. The same thinning ratios have been applied to this one, 30 to 40%, depending on your personal preferences, and also again the same settings for the airbrush. If you guys are interested in testing out these paints for yourself, I will be leaving links in the description down below to where you can purchase these. So after completing that first coat, you can just decide to let it cure or speed up the process. Now the paint here is still really wet and you can see it's a bit glossy and a bit blotchy, and when I apply some heat to it with a hairdryer or a blow dryer, it speeds up the process of curing a lot. Now, I'm not sure if this is advised by the manufacturer. I personally just like to use this quick little tip as it does speed up the process for water-based paints to cure a lot. And it's really easy to see if it is cured or not. As uncured, it is still pretty glossy, and once it starts to cure, as you can see right here, the glossiness starts to be removed and is turning into a matte finish. Now I did notice a couple of imperfections in the paint on this one, so after curing it with a blow dryer, I moved on to sanding out those imperfections before I applied another couple coats of primer in order to prepare it for the color to go on later. So after just going over it with the heat gun, blow dryer, hair dryer for a couple seconds, it is fully cured and you're pretty much safe to touch it. Now, of course, just be sure that it is actually cured before sanding or handling, and then move on to just cleaning it off again, applying more primer, or moving on to your next stage in the paint job. So like I said multiple times in the video, I'm going to be painting this one in a nice bright pink just to make it stand out from the rest and give it a super cool drifter car style look. So for the paint, after applying the primer, I need to mix that up. So I put in the amount of paint that I think I'm going to need and adding the thinners to it as well. Now for colors, this is a little less thinner than it is for the primers. This is about 20 to 30%, but I do advise to start at the low end of that thinning ratio and maybe add even more thinner to that if you have tested it and it doesn't seem to flow through the airbrush. So I applied about 20-30% of thinner to this paint mixture, started on the hard to reach, easy to forget spots, and then moved on to the rest of the body for the first initial coat. Now again, just with the primers, the settings of the airbrush have not changed. I kept them the same as I always do. So during the application of the first coat, I did notice that I accidentally over-thinned the paint a bit. And when over-thinning, it does try to creep away from some of the panel lines or just bigger spots in the middle of a piece where it just leaves a bit of a bubble and a hole where the paint just doesn't want to stick to it. Now it's not really that big of a deal. You just add a bit more color to your paint mixture just to make it a bit thinner. So don't add extra thinner, just a bit more color. And then you could just easily blend those areas in by applying a couple light coats or light mists on top of the areas that have creeped away, just to blend it in again and make it a nice finish overall. Now again, during blending, keep the coats thin as you don't want to overdo it, and make it consistent and blend it in nicely. And after that has been done, you can just move on to the next couple coats to finish off the color application. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, Mission Models and Domino sent out a pretty big range of paints, including their 1K Clear. Now, I personally am not really a big fan of 1K Clear, as it doesn't really dry as glossy. It's not as strong of a finish, and it requires a lot more work to get super smooth and glossy in the end, with a lot of polishing, sanding, and all that jazz. So what I decided to do, since this paint is compatible with pretty much any other brand of paint on the market, is to add a nice glossy 2K Clear on top of it from Streetblisters. With the first coat of clear now applied, I set it aside to cure for about 5 minutes, added some more clear onto the airbrush, and sprayed on the second and final coat of clear. If you guys are interested in testing out these paints for yourself, I will be leaving links in the description down below to where you can purchase these. The second coat of clear has been applied. The finish is just the way that I like it, really smooth, super glossy, and ready to move on to the next stage of the build. I'm just going to set it aside to cure for a couple of days before touching it again, and in the meantime probably start on the interior, also trying out some other colors of Mission Models for that part, to try and finish out the entire build using mostly Mission Models paints, and to see how they work on all these different components for the chassis, the interior, and as you can see here, the exterior. So far, I'm really happy. The primer is super nice. It dries out really smooth, sands easily, and the colors are really easy to apply as well. Now, one thing to keep note of, it does require mixing with thinners, so that might be a bit harder for beginning airbrushers, but it is really clearly stated how to thin it. Just keep it a little lower than they suggest, and try to build up the amount of thinner just to see if it flows through the way you would like it to.